I'm Caroline Bailey.
And I'm Lucy Boyadris.
And today we're talking about Nixon's presidency and how the Cold War fluctuated between periods of direct and indirect military confrontation and periods of mutual coexistence or détente.
Public confidence and trust in the government's ability to solve social and economic problems declined in the 1970s in the wake of economic challenges, political scandals, and foreign policy crises.
Richard Nixon began his political career practicing law at Duke University. World War II, Nixon was a Navy lieutenant commander in the Pacific. Before becoming the conservative vice president, Nixon served as a U.S. representative and senator from California. After becoming the 37th president of the United States in 1969 through the Watergate scandal, Nixon became the only president to ever resign. Nixon had many accomplishments while in office, and some of these included the end of the new draft, new anti-crime laws, a broad environmental program, revenue sharing, and his idea of détente. Détente, meaning coexistence, was the name given to the time of improved relations between the U.S. and the Soviet Union that began in 1971. And Nixon coined this name after visiting the Secretary General of the Soviet Communist Party. Détente included the increase of trade and reduction of danger of the nuclear warfare between the two nations. This kept attention on his foreign policy achievements rather than domestic problems that he faced at home from the Vietnam War. In such a harsh political climate that was divided on the Vietnam War, this meant that Nixon needed aggressive tactics in order to win re-election. The committee to re-elect the president broke into the Democratic National Committee's Watergate headquarters and stole copies of top-secret documents and bugged the office's phones. Nixon gave a speech where he swore that his staff was not involved in the break-in, and some people, including the Washington Post, started to suspect that there was a larger scheme, and that some of his White House staff testified before a grand jury that Nixon was guilty. The House of Representatives voted to impeach him for obstruction of justice, abuse of power, criminal cover-up, and several violations of the Constitution. Nixon then resigned on August 8th to avoid impeachment by the Senate. This then created a negative effect on the American political life, making an atmosphere of distrust, and further added to the political disappointment that was the Vietnam War.
During the 1970s, there was a huge decline in public confidence and trust in the government, and this was partly due to the many economic challenges of the time period. So during the 70s, the stock market was a mess. It lost 40% in an 18-month period, and for almost a decade, few people wanted anything to do with stocks whatsoever. Additionally, economic growth was really weak at the time, which resulted in rising unemployment rates that eventually reached double digits. In the 50s and 60s leading up to this decade, easy money policies were really effective and really popular, but they ultimately resulted in high inflation during the 70s, and eventually the Great Inflation, which I'll talk about. In addition to easy money policies, the stock market, and high inflation, the central bank was under different leadership at this time. And it would eventually reverse its policy and ended up raising interest rates to some 20%, which was a big loss for the economy. So for the Great Inflation, which was definitely the biggest economic crisis of the time period, originally it was blamed on oil prices, currency speculators, greedy businessmen, and union leaders. However, after kind of carefully considering the monetary policies, especially of Nixon during the 70s, it became clear that those monetary policies, which financed huge budget deficits, were the ultimate cause of the Great Inflation. So Nixon inherited the recession from Lyndon Johnson, who spent very generously on Great Society and the Vietnam War, and Congress continued to fund the war, and they increased social welfare spending, which led to a decrease in, obviously, government money. So in 1971, Nixon imposed wage and price control as kind of a means of raising revenue. And at first, they seemed to work really well during the following election year, which is one of the reasons that he got reelected. However, they basically fueled the fire for that same double-digit inflation that I mentioned. And once they were removed, individuals and the public businesses basically had to try to build from the ground up to regain the money that they had lost due to the price control. This also played a big role in foreign policy as well, because Nixon's deficits through his monetary policies made dollar holders internationally really nervous. And there was a run on the dollar, which many foreigners and even Americans thought was very overvalued. So in 1971, Nixon broke the last link to gold, which basically turned the American dollar into a fiat currency. So the result of this was that the American dollar was devalued, and millions of internationals who were holding those American dollars, especially the Arab oil barons with tens of millions of petrodollars, saw the value of the American dollar to be slashed and diminished, um, basically contributing to the primary economic challenges of the time period. So during the 1970s, there was also a big foreign policy crisis, and Henry Kissinger, who played a pretty big role in this, quoted once that old international patterns are crumbling. The world has become independent in economics, in communications, and in human aspirations. And this was kind of a quote that just summed up the entire time period and was pretty iconic during the 70s. During this decade, there was a pretty big rise in globalization, which is essentially the process in which businesses or other organizations develop international influence or start operating on an international scale. And this played a huge role in the 1973 to 1974 oil crisis, where third world Arabs forced the global economy into a huge decline. So in October 1973, there was a big oil embargo, and by the end of the embargo in March 1974, the price of oil rose from $3 US per barrel to nearly $12 globally, and US prices were significantly higher. And ultimately, the embargo caused a crisis in the entire global economy, which left both short and long term aftershocks. Um, it was later titled the first oil crisis because there was a second one that came in 1979, but it was not nearly as significant as the oil crisis with the third world Arabs in 1973. And this basically was a massive foreign policy crisis and pretty much the only one, but it left lasting impacts for a really long time and on a ton of different people.